Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the after-midnight avenues of New York, where streetlights glow softly on quiet sidewalks, and power moves with a gentle, knowing smile. This is the world of Rosario Gambino, a man of charm and calculation, where influence was earned through conversation, not confrontation, and every handshake carried meaning beneath the surface. Most people could never live a life like this, not because it was loud or violent, but because it demanded patience, emotional control, and the ability to read a room before a single word was spoken. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the smooth, quietly powerful story of Rosario Gambino. The night Rosario first understood how small a life could look from far away, he was 12, and the harbor had emptied except for a single boat rocking like a slow thought. He sat on the seawall with his knees pulled up, and the town's lamps painted the water in strips of orange. A fisherman pushed off, rowed for a while, and then the small light wavered and became a dot swallowed by the black. From where he sat, Rosario felt the harbor's voices shrink into one steady, distant hum. He learned in that instant, distance does not erase things, but it changes their urgency. That knowledge settled into him like a muscle. His neighborhood was full of people who spoke quickly and cared passionately. They argued over trivial things and celebrated small mercies with loud dinners. Life there was immediate. It insisted on being seen, on being handled before dawn brought some fresh trouble. Rosario's father ran a tiny procurement shop, the kind of place that traded in predictable things: flour, cheap tobacco, a coil of rope for a neighbor, credit recorded with a pencil in a battered ledger. The men who came in at dawn wanted the world steady enough to schedule bread and work. That routine offered a kind of dignity, and Rosario watched it with the same attention he had once paid to boats. He was not the loudest child. He had a face that could slip into a crowd, and a patience that made other boys mistake him for faintness of desire. They called him quiet at first, the sort of quiet that lets you overhear more than you participate in. But quiet can be powerful when it is chosen. Rosario learned that words have costs and that the loud ones often left bills unpaid. He learned to speak in ways that made others reveal what they valued. A question instead of a demand, a small, well-placed compliment, the precise silence that lets the other person fill the space with what they're afraid to say. These were his early tools. As he grew, he found himself fascinated by movement. Not reckless movement, flights or blazes of attention, but the slow, patient logistics of things that arrived where they had to be. He watched truck drivers tie down a load as carefully as a surgeon lays out instruments. He paid attention to timetables, not because he revered them, but because he understood their consequence. A delayed shipment meant a baker without flour and a family without bread. The neighborhood's small economies were fragile machines, and Rosario learned to love their cogs. School taught him the exactness of numbers. The market taught him the art of reading people. In the afternoons, he would help his father at the shop and memorize names and debts. On certain nights, elders would gather in low-lit rooms and speak more slowly than they did in the street. They traded gossip and small favors and remembered who had repaid whom. Those conversations felt like a map, and Rosario learned to read it. It was not ethics in a bookish sense. It was an ethic of repair. If you break something, you make it whole again. If you keep your promises, people find ways to trust you. Trust, he began to see, was the most valuable currency of all. Opportunity arrived for him early, not as a golden door, but as a narrow path that required balance. A cousin who had gone north and come back with pockets that rattled offered Rosario a job moving crates on the docks. It was honest, physical work, and it let him learn the city's arteries, where goods moved, who handled them, where they slowed. The docks taught him more than muscle. They taught him the poetry of timing. You could stand and watch an unloading and see 100 small decisions made before a crate crossed a threshold. He apprenticed himself to patterns. Which ferries were reliable in fog, which lanes filled with traffic at certain hours, which men cut corners and paid for it later. There were choices too, quiet opportunities that asked for a soft compromise. A man with an easy smile suggested that some crates might be more valuable if they moved through less official channels. Rosario listened and didn't answer immediately. He weighed the small human costs against the promise of quick money. Quick money arrives like high tide. It lifts everything briefly and then retreats with jagged edges. He watched neighbors who had taken those tides and saw the long tail of consequences, abrupt disappearances, empty promises, debts traded like dirt. That scene hardened his judgment. If he was going to move nearer to power, would do it in ways that left people reasonably whole, not reckless shortcuts that made him rich and everyone else poor. So he chose a third option, not saintliness, not reckless profit, but the practical art of arranging. He learned to make favors legible, to keep them as notes in a ledger rather than as rumors in passageways. He learned that some favors required patience, others required an upfront sacrifice. When he helped a baker by rerouting a late shipment for a small fee, he made sure the baker knew precisely what the cost was and that repayment terms were realistic. That transparency kept relationships intact. People didn't love him because he was generous. They relied on him because he honored agreements in a way that kept their mornings predictable. Over years, his reputation widened, not because he sought notoriety, but because reliability spreads like a scent. If you are the person who can make a broken promise into a fixed one, people will tell others about you. Men with more money than patience began to notice him. They enjoyed his way of transforming risk into a manageable thing. He taught them to treat problems as repairable items and to price the repair into the deal. That approach saved both money and dignity in ways that made him quietly useful. Yet influence brings its own calculus. When you are the one who aligns shipments and makes payrolls possible by gentle intervention, you learn that proximity to choices can create temptation. Money stands where need stands, and sometimes the two glimmer in the same place. Rosario watched young men reach for the glitter without understanding the debt their reach would demand. He kept his ledger, and he kept it private. He would take calculated chances, yes, but not ones where the cost would cascade through the people who trusted him. In the world he moved in, there was also a geography of distance. Sometimes the best safeguard was to be slightly removed, enough to observe the pressure without being crushed by it. The farther you are from the center of a wild decision, the more you can see the ripples that will follow. Rosario used distance not as cowardice, but as caution. He learned to let the loudest voices burn out while the quietly persistent ones shaped outcomes. He cultivated friends who were skilled in certain things, a man who knew shipping law, a woman with a way of smoothing bureaucratic anger with a phone call, a driver who never missed a delivery because he was always early. Partnerships like this turned single points of failure into networks of resilience. When he was 25, a period of real change arrived. The neighborhood aged, and new money arrived, slick suits, smiling faces promising modernization. Investors from cities far away brought talk of consolidation and efficiency. They explained how scale would lift everyone's boats. The language was technical and seductive. In meeting rooms above glass and chrome, they sketched charts that seemed inevitable. Streamline, they said, optimize. But hidden under their optimism was a simple truth. Efficiency is often an arithmetic that benefits those already capitalized. It can displace the small margins people rely on. Rosario listened to their promises and watched the patterns he knew. Consolidation often meant a few hands at the top and many hands pushed to the fringes. He did not oppose change by reflex. He believed that better systems can ease lives. He wanted genuinely to see more people settle with steadier mornings. But he also knew the stories of abrupt change. Businesses folding because they lost a small contract, drivers losing routes that fed families, a sudden reshuffle of local credit lines. His question always was practical. Who pays in the month the system fails? Who eats when the payroll is delayed for any reason? Who finds a way if the model that promised efficiency misses a storm or a strike? Those were the sorts of questions that made the investors uncomfortable because they did not look like profit. So he proposed a different path, one that sounded less exciting but was sturdier. Pilot programs, shared oversight, funds reserved for emergency payrolls, retraining budgets. He argued his points in small rooms and in long nights where his partners, some older, some younger, threw their candid assessments into the pot. A few laughed, others listened and nodded. The third option, scaling with repair, felt like slow medicine. It required sacrifice from those who wanted
fastest returns. It required capital to be patient, the way a neighbor is patient with a man fixing his roof, willing to help now and not demand payment until the shingles hold. This stance placed him at a curious axis. Investors wanted growth in a hurry. Progressive city officials wanted modernization. Many of the neighborhood's small operators were fearful and curious. Rosario found himself in the middle, not because he sought a throne, but because his skill set, careful arrangement, reliable mediation, and ethical ledger made him useful as a translator between different logics. He brokered conversations, not bargains that erased obligations, but ones that articulated them clearly. His role felt less like command and more like stewardship. And stewardship is heavy work. It asks you to keep seeing all the consequences, even the ones that require personal compromise. Rosario had to be willing to say no sometimes, to refuse deals that paid well in the heady present but threatened to hollow out the neighborhood's mornings. Saying no cost him opportunities and sometimes the scorn of those who wanted fast returns. But it kept others in their stalls, and for him, that kind of preservation mattered more than a quick headline. Still, the lure of distance and the sea never left him. When decisions piled up and voices grew too loud, he would walk to the harbor, sit on the seawall, and watch boats become small lights. He liked to think in that quiet place about how systems are networks of obligations and how a single broken chain can topple 1,000 small routines. He believed in the human scale of repair, a fund that covers 3 months of payroll, a driver guaranteed a return route when traffic snarls, a mechanism that ensures credit does not evaporate overnight. These were not glamorous fixes, but they were effective ones. By the time he reached his 30s, Rosario had built a web of relationships that kept the neighborhood functioning in ways that spreadsheets rarely captured. He had authority, yes, but it was the kind you earn by showing up for small things over and over. Payouts that made the papers rarely interested him. He wanted the mornings, the ordinary pulse of life that makes small businesses viable and families stable. He had learned that influence without care is a brittle thing. Care without influence is ineffectual. The trick for him was to combine both. At the edge of night now, as the harbor lay smooth and the town's lights blurred their reflections, he felt the weight of decisions arriving on a horizon he could not yet see clearly. New actors were in the city. New incentives were being whispered into ears that had once listened only to rusted coins. He had to choose, bend to the loud current of quick change, or double down on the painstaking architecture of repair. His choice would determine, in small but deep ways, which mornings continued and which ones stuttered. He rose from the seawall and walked back through streets that bent between stone buildings and small plants that grew in cracked sidewalks. People were closing shutters, washing dishes, preparing for another morning. The ledger in his head was full. Names, promises, the locations of key routes, the times when a certain ferry was unreliable. He knew that tomorrow he would be called to more meetings, more negotiations. He was ready for the meetings. But first, he would sleep and let the distance he had cultivated do what it always did, make the world seem a little clearer and the tides a little easier to understand. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about another lesson the sea had taught him. You cannot control the waves, but you can learn where the sand is deep and where the rocks lie. The art is not to command the sea, but to place your boats where the tides are forgiving. He closed his eyes with that stubborn, quiet conviction. The story, he knew, was only beginning. The months after that night on the seawall folded into each other like business cards stacked on a counter, neat, functional, each one a small promise. Rosario moved through them in the rhythm he had learned. Watch, listen, make an intervention only when it solved a real problem. He did not court drama, he courted usefulness. People began to notice that usefulness. They came to him with questions that were not flashy but mattered. How to keep a route going during strike season. How to make credit clear between neighbors without humiliating anybody. How to shift a shipment so a small shop could meet its payroll. One of the first tests of his approach arrived quietly, as most true tests do. A mid-tier supplier, reliable for years but thin in capital, found itself suddenly short. The cause was mundanely bureaucratic, a delayed paper from a municipal office that held up a line of credit. The supplier called, not with anger, but with a practical fear. If the line didn't move, dozens of shops would lack flour for the next morning. That kind of failure isn't a headline. It is a small catastrophe for families who count on continuity. Rosario moved in ways that had become familiar to those who watched him. He called an old acquaintance at the municipal office, not a favor in the dramatic sense, but a helpful nudge that clarified what documents exactly were required to release the hold. He arranged a short bridge loan drawn from a small trust fund he had helped set up years before with friends and business partners who preferred to help each other without publicity. The supplier paid the loan back within the month, with a modest thank you and a promise written on a scrap that meant more than a banknote. "We keep mornings." People noticed the phrase and liked it, not because it was catchy, but because it meant someone had intervened without spectacle. That was the pattern he favored, preemptive repair. When a problem shows itself as a slow leak, patch it early and quietly. When it becomes a geyser, the moral calculus changes and the repair costs multiply. He preferred prevention because it minimized humiliation. People survive errors when they are handled gently. When errors become public, pride hardens and fixes require theater. He avoided theater with the same stubbornness he avoided publicity. His role as a mediator placed him between different logics. Some men he dealt with were older, moved by the arithmetic of relationships and reputation. Others were younger and excited by the sharp promises of scale. A dry goods magnate from another borough visited with a glossy analyst and a map that showed projected savings from consolidation. The magnate spoke in numbers, which in his world were the clearest form of truth. Rosario listened and asked practical follow-ups. What happens when a storm shutters the transit precisely in the week your model projects maximal gains? Who covers payroll when the algorithm misses a bridge closing? The analyst had models and backtests. Rosario had human stories. He asked that those models bake in human buffers, funds, retraining budgets, and guaranteed payroll protections. And when the analyst hesitated, he suggested pilot projects instead of full rollouts. Pilots were the tool he most trusted. A pilot forces an idea into a small space where it either proves itself under diverse conditions or shows the flaws that must be fixed. He had seen too many all-in implementations that assumed smooth roads and cooperative weather. Pilots respected the fact that complex urban systems have habits and histories that spreadsheets cannot fully capture. He insisted on them with a simple phrase that had become his shorthand: test, measure, repair. It kept meetings practical and reduced the theater that magnates loved. He also began to assemble a modest team. He could not steward everything alone forever. There was Marco, a driver turned organizer who had an ear for how routes were felt by those who drove them every day. Marco knew who took risks for extra pay and who refused them because of family needs. Then there was Lucia, who kept the ledgers and had the dry patience of someone who could hold two conflicting accounts in her head and reconcile them without drama. Together, they formed the kind of practical leadership Rosario favored. People who could translate abstract policy into a schedule a driver could read without surprise. The team's first big task was the design of a community escrow, a modest but real fund that would be used, strictly and transparently, to cover immediate payroll and urgent repairs in the event of transition failure. The idea was simple:
If the consolidation or technological transition failed in its first months, the escrow would keep the smallest operators afloat while retraining and replacement arrangements were activated. The fund did not eliminate risk, it lowered the cost of failure enough to avert catastrophic loss. Raising the escrow required negotiation. Investors understood the math of capital. Escrow funds looked like friction. Rosario pitched the escrow not as a moral burden on profit, but as an insurance policy that made the overall enterprise less risky. If you can guarantee continuity, he argued, your client relationships are steadier and asset attrition falls, both good for returns. He framed the escrow in language investors respected, as a mitigation tool. Pretty slides were not his style. He used plain arithmetic and a ledger Lucia helped him compile that showed exactly the human and financial cost of a missed payroll across a range of failure scenarios. It worked with enough investors to seed a fund that was small but credible. That accomplishment was quiet but meaningful. It meant that when someone proposed bold consolidation moves and the pilots proved rocky, there would be a mechanism to soften the impact. It also meant that the community could insist on terms that protected mornings without having to rely solely on rhetoric. Contracts were useful when they had teeth. The escrow gave the teeth context. Still, not everyone welcomed these measured approaches. In boardrooms beyond the neighborhood, men who fetishized speed muttered about bureaucracy. They saw the escrow as friction, a drag on potential returns. They boasted about nimbleness and the ability to pivot quickly. Rosario's response was patient and practical. Agility is useful if you can refinance a ruined life. If not, agility becomes a mechanism of escape for those who profit while others rebuild the damage. His phrasing annoyed them because it forced them to translate abstract profit into explicit human cost. Within the neighborhood, there were other subtler tensions. Younger operators, especially those who had grown up in the fast-moving culture of instant contracts and quick capital, bristled at the slower pace. They could see the attraction of a platform that promised immediate access to routes and clients. Rosario did not disdain technology. He respected tools that augmented judgment. He distrusted anything that promised to replace judgment with a formula and then pretended the formula did not have consequences. He insisted that the platform pilots the investors preferred include human override features and that drivers retain control over certain constraints, school runs, preferred off days, and family obligations that the algorithm could not ethically override. These debates shaped him. He had to become more fluent in the language of algorithms while remaining fluent in the language of human consequence. Lucia helped him by translating tech speak into roster realities. If a route is reassigned automatically at 2 a.m., who covers childcare? Marco translated driver concerns into contract language that protected time without sacrificing opportunities. Their collaboration looked practical and human. It was intended to be replicable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's social fabric changed in small ways that mattered. A new cafe opened that paid its staff a small premium for consistent hours, rather than relying on tips. A hardware store shifted to digital invoicing, but kept a small stack of ledgers for clients uncomfortable with change. These adjustments signaled that modernization need not always mean erasure. It could be negotiated. The trick, Rosario believed, was to keep the people who matter, the workers, the small proprietors, at the center of conversation, rather than as passive beneficiaries. In the midst of all this negotiation, a personal moment jolted him. His father fell ill one winter, a long, slow sickness that made the small procurement shop less a business model than a home of memories. Rosario found himself attending to details he had left to others, licensing paperwork, small repairs, and the mundane kindnesses that keep a shop alive when the first person who loved it is gone. The shop's ledger, the same battered notebook his father had used, contained decades of tiny debts and small favors.
Paying those debts, making discreet arrangements with creditors, and keeping the shop's rhythm going felt like a sacred duty. It reminded him of why his work mattered. It was not about architecture or policy only. It was about the continuity that lets people plan their days. The shop's modest endurance was a private victory, but it had public consequences. People saw Rosario in action, not as a distant negotiator, but as someone who solved small, painful problems with patience. The labor of tending his father's business gave him renewed legitimacy. He had always argued for
systems that preserved ordinary mornings. Here was a life he could point to as evidence of what such systems did. That winter also taught him the value of a distributed bench. The apprentices and the small team he had cultivated began to act more independently. Marco negotiated a temporary consolidation between two small operators that preserved routes and increased efficiency, without the heavy-handedness the larger investors favored. Lucia rewrote invoicing processes to be more transparent to customers and workers alike. The elders in the neighborhood saw these changes not as betrayals of tradition, but as adjustments that kept the old rhythms alive in a modern register. Watching their competence grow reassured Rosario. It meant his work could persist as a practice, not as an individual dependency. He also began to think about story. How you tell the story of change matters. If modernization is presented only as efficiency, it alienates those whose lives it disrupts. If it is told as a collaborative process with safeguards and transparent trade-offs, people participate rather than resist. He began inviting local journalists to ride along on night runs, not for grand features, but to witness the human choreography of keeping goods moving. He invited city staff to breakfast with garage mechanics to hear about the small fixes that reduce large breakdowns. These moves were slow and boring at times, but they accumulated into a public sense that something different was happening here. Modernization with portable dignity. By spring, the pilots had produced enough data to convince a new cohort of investors that cautious scaling was manageable. The language of returns adjusted slightly to include terms like sustainable margins and worker retention. Those phrases pleased no one as much as they pleased Rosario, because they meant the practical safeguards had been woven into the financial fabric. He had not wanted the escrow or the human overrides to be mere moral gestures. He wanted them to be practical levers that changed behavior. If the market could adapt to include them, the protections would be harder to remove when pressure returned. Of course, pressure did return. It always does. A new platform pitched a shiny interface and a promise of instant visibility with less friction than any broker. Its demo was persuasive. Its capitalization was substantial. It proposed to connect drivers, shops, and routes in a way that made markets look seamless. Rosario met them not with hostility, but with a stack of questions. Who controls data? What happens when the algorithm displaces routes in favor of cheaper drivers? How quickly can the system pause to protect someone's guaranteed time? And what share of profit would seed retraining and emergency funds? The platform's representatives smiled and offered terms that read well until he asked about recourse. Their contracts were thin, where Lucia's ledger was muscular. Negotiation, in his experience, did not produce a single decisive moment so much as it produced a pattern of small concessions and guarded victories. He insisted on a phased integration, joint data governance, and binding commitments to fund community protections in proportion to revenue generated on the platform. If they wished to race ahead, they would only do so with explicit agreements that the neighborhood's safety net would grow in tandem. The platform bristled at some conditions, but accepted others. Not every negotiation ended in his favor. He had long ago learned to take partial wins and turn them into new safeguards. The world was not a place of perfect choices. It was a place where small institutions and careful people could press out enough margin to keep mornings from fracturing. That incrementalism did not satisfy headline-hungry men, but it satisfied the people who had to feed children in the morning. And so the second part of the story closed not with a single declaration, but with a set of modest realities. An escrow that could actually pay a payroll, a platform that had agreed to human override clauses, apprentices trusted with real authority, and a neighborhood whose mornings felt a little less precarious.
Rosario walked the same seawall one evening as the light fell, and he watched a boat become a dot. He felt not triumph, but the sober satisfaction of someone who had placed a few sturdy planks across a small but dangerous gap. He knew this was not the end. The pressures for scale, the hunger for
quick profit, the charm of new technologies would return in other forms. New investors would come with new languages. The people who remained vulnerable would still need protection. He also knew, with a clarity that had become his habit, that the work of repair is never finished. It is only renewed and rewritten by those willing to stay in the room and ask the same human questions until they become ordinary. For now, that patience felt like enough. He turned from the water and walked back into the neighborhood, ready for whatever small problem would ask him to solve it next. The summer after the escrow was funded moved with a brittle, careful energy, like people walking across a frozen pond, listening for the thinness beneath their feet. Rosario felt that attentiveness as a physical thing. He watched meetings the way he once watched ferries, for the way they slowed and for the little signals that told you whether the craft would make it in rough water. The pilots continued to produce data, and the data kept coming back with a mix of promise and plain human complexity. On clear, ordinary days, the platform matched shippers to drivers and shops to stock with an elegance that pleased the analysts. On the days the city was noisy or weathered, the matches faltered in ways that spreadsheets could not hide. An automated reroute that shaved 12 minutes on paper could mean a single mother missing the only morning she could run to the clinic while her child was at school. Numbers that looked tidy in boardroom light often hid inconvenient human timing. That was why Rosario had insisted on human override clauses. It was why he had made the escrow real money, not a symbolic pledge. The pilots showed, over months, that when the algorithm tried to push people toward efficiency without regard for non-monetary needs, the system's social friction rose. Complaints piled up. People stopped trusting the interface. Trust, once fractured, was slow to reassemble. Still, the platform's engineers could point to metrics that glowed. Fewer empty legs, higher fill rates, faster average delivery times. Investors liked the glow. They translated it into predictions that read like promises. The problem was not the engineers' work. Many of them were earnest and genuinely wanted to craft useful tools, but the way capital viewed those tools as levers to be pulled hard and quickly. One morning, an investor arrived with a glossy packet and a smile that made everything seem thinner than it was. "Accelerate the rollout," he said, as if it were a friendly suggestion rather than a decision with consequences. "We can scale to the neighboring district in weeks, not months. The model works. More scale means more revenue." Rosario put a hand on the packet, feeling the texture of the paper through his palm. He thought of the fairy lights. He thought of the neat ledger on his kitchen shelf. He thought of the baker who had once slid an extra loaf to a stranger without asking. That loaf had anchored a morning for someone whose pay was late. "Show me the failure case with names and dates," Rosario said, and his voice was the calm you feel before a tide. The investor blinked, as if hearing that question for the first time. "You mean a stress test?" the investor offered. "Numbers again." Rosario nodded and asked for a different thing. "No, I mean a lived stress test. Show me 1 month where the algorithm fails and list the people who will need help that week. Tell me how the escrow covers them and who manages the outreach. Detail it like it's a payroll." The investor swallowed. He had models. He did not have the small human arithmetic Rosario requested. That was not his job, perhaps, but it was Rosario's. He believed that if capital wanted scale quickly, it should be forced to reckon with the people who would be most exposed when speed faltered. If an investor could not produce that arithmetic, then the neighborhood should not accept their money without protective measures that were enforceable and immediate. It was a small victory when the investor agreed to fund an expanded pilot contingent on the neighborhood's conditions. The victory felt practical rather than triumphant. The investor left with a caveat. Rosario and his team got a larger sandbox in which to test both machine and human responses. Those months produced a series of ordinary crises that revealed how fragile new systems could be and how robust simple remedies often were. A thief ring.
operating across districts and using stolen IDs to game the platform's onboarding, surfaced in late August. It wasn't a cinematic heist. It was paper fraud and a few ill-timed deliveries, but it had the power to shatter trust if left unchecked. Drivers received mismatched pay. Small vendors found accounts drained or credited incorrectly. The platform's helpline, designed for common hiccups, was not prepared for organized gaming of identity verifications. Rosario's response was unostentatious and precise. He convened a small task force that included Lucia to audit the ledgers, Marco to test driver verification in the field, an independent technologist to examine the onboarding pipeline, and a city compliance officer to help expedite ID checks that the platform's automated system had accepted erroneously. They worked like a surgical team, discreet, efficient, focused on measurable fixes. Within 2 weeks, the exploit was closed, reimbursement plans were activated using the escrow for frontline relief, and new verification measures were piloted that required a blend of human touch and stronger identity checks. The neatness of that response gave people confidence, and confidence spread more as a practical contagion than any marketing campaign could. Drivers who had feared their hours being unfairly deducted found their logs corrected. Flower vendors who had lost pre-orders received priority allocations later that month as an act of compensation. The platform engineers, chastened and grateful, adapted code to reduce the risk of similar gaming. The investor who had promised rapid scale took note. The cost of speed without oversight had been made explicit. Not all tests had solutions so clean. A foreign shipping broker, someone from Rosario's old world, someone who had crossed the sea in his youth and who still spoke of routes in terms of tides, reached out with news of an upstream delay. A container of specialty grain meant for artisan bakers had been detained abroad for regulatory reasons. The detention had nothing to do with the neighborhood's platform or pilots, yet its effect would cascade into doorsteps before the week was out. Bakers relied on particular flours for textures and rush orders for holidays. Rosario received the call in the afternoon, the kind of small panic that stacks into larger trouble if left unattended. He called the broker and then the consulate, leveraging a combination of old favors and legible paperwork. He negotiated an emergency partial release, a limited shipment that could be rerouted through smaller ports and then trucked, slowly but surely, into the city. It cost more. It required a patchwork of payments and a driver willing to take a long haul in exchange for a guarantee backed by the escrow. But the shipments arrived in time for a weekend of high demand, and the bakers breathed easily. The cost came from the fund, which the neighborhood then replenished via a small levy on participating businesses that accepted the necessity of a shared safety net. They called this, privately and in jest, paying for the tide. Those little rescues, the fraud fix, the rerouted flour, built a narrative. The system was not infallible, but it could be mended quickly if people trusted the process. Trust, however, is not about a single act of repair. It is about repetition. So Rosario continued to press for systems that made repair predictable rather than performative. If a driver had a family emergency and missed a shift, they would still receive pay that week while a temporary replacement was arranged. If an account was erroneously settled by an automated rule, the resolution timeline had to be less than 48 hours or the escrow would bridge it automatically. Those were the sorts of rules the neighborhood settled on: small, practical, enforceable. With these mechanisms in place, the neighborhood's pilots matured into a more confident operation, and the platform began to feel less like an alien tool and more like an instrument people could play together. The apprentices grew more competent and began to lead. Rosa organized a training schedule for drivers that mixed platform literacy with rights awareness. Marco set up a peer review system for dispatchers that made manual overrides faster and less arbitrary. Lucia tightened the ledgers so reimbursements were not only documented, but transparent. And yet, as the neighborhood fortified itself, new pressures found new leverage points. A developer with a foreign shipping broker, someone from Rosario's old world,
Someone who had crossed the sea in his youth and who still spoke of routes in terms of tides, reached out with news of an upstream delay.
Municipal Connections proposed a logistics hub project that would tuck the neighborhood's operational center into a larger complex 3 towns over. On paper, it promised improved loading docks and cleaner streets. In practice, it would relocate work, place more reliance on the platform, and give the hub owner the power to reassign contracts centrally. For some small operators, a modern hub meant cleaner facilities. For others, it meant losing the neighborhood's local relationships and the informal credit lines that made survival possible in lean months. Rosario convened a long meeting at the community center to discuss the hub. He invited the developer, city aides, investor representatives, drivers, shop owners, and those who administered the escrow. Everyone spoke, and the language shifted quickly between spreadsheets and stories. Staffers wrote checklists about zoning and traffic flow. Drivers spoke about childcare constraints and the routes that allowed them to make school runs. A bakery owner spoke quietly about trusting a man who had delivered at dawn for years and how a sudden rebid of contracts could cost him his best morning people. When the developer, pressed by eagerness and earnest salesmanship, brushed over the human stuff as friction that modern systems solve, Rosario asked him, calmly, "If night parking is moved and your hub delays a route that our baker needs, who pays for the missed pay that week?" The developer had the standard answer about indemnities and liability clauses. Rosario asked for a plan that included a guaranteed transitional payroll for affected workers for 6 months post-move, an enforceable hiring preference for displaced drivers, and a binding commitment to honor local credit lines during the transition period. The developer hesitated. He had not anticipated this level of local demand on project terms. The negotiation that followed was long and costly. It forced money to be allocated for human costs rather than merely creating a glossy new center. Some investors grumbled that the hub would be less competitive in the short term, and a few argued that it would scare off capital. But Rosario and his team insisted that if the hub wanted to base itself in the neighborhood's orbit, it would have to accept that durability meant explicit cost sharing for the people most at risk. The developer conceded in principle and then tried to wriggle on specifics. The oversight committee insisted on legal language and escrow arrangements. The developer, to his credit, signed a binding memorandum that included some of Rosario's protections. What remained would be spelled out in contract addendums to be reviewed publicly. When the hub's initial plans were announced, amended, slower moving, but with enforced protections, the neighborhood felt simultaneously relieved and wary. The hub promised investment and modern facilities. It also promised to enshrine protections Rosario had fought for, though the precise effectiveness of those protections would be proven only by time, audits, and, if necessary, enforcement actions. The experience taught Rosario that progress could be legitimate if progress agreed to be accountable. That was the lesson he could sell to investors who preferred narrative over nuance. Accountability is a marketable asset when it reduces political and social risk. Amid these policy fights and practical fixes, Rosario kept his own ledger and his private rituals. He still walked to the water some evenings, watching boats become dots as the sun folded away. The sea, which had once taught him that distance changes urgency, now taught him something else. Distance can also be used to carry promises. A promise made in a harbor town can travel wide and still arrive intact if someone tends it along the route. He thought about those routes, about the men and women who depended on them, and about how easy it can be to lose sight of the people served when dazzled by the efficiency of a system. The season closed with a modest public report showing that the pilots, under the neighborhood's conditions, had improved overall delivery reliability while protecting a non-trivial number of jobs. It was not a miraculous shift, it was an institutional correction. The platform's chief engineer praised the human overrides in an op-ed. A local paper ran a measured piece on the escrow's effectiveness. Investors recalibrated their timetables. The hub's memorandum went to legal teams for specific drafting.
The neighborhood did not celebrate so much as it breathed. That breath was itself a kind of victory.
Rosario had learned, in the midst of all this, that victories in this work are rarely clean or permanent. They require maintenance. So he spent the quieter days not speaking loudly in grand rooms, but inventorying small things. Which drivers needed training next week? Which shops required clearer invoicing? Which apprentices required more authority? He cataloged the gaps and made plans not for headlines, but for checks and rechecks. The ledger in his head was full of names and small obligations, and he liked it that way. One evening, as September softened into an early chill, a letter arrived that made him sit down. It was an old-style envelope, thick with paper, and the handwriting on the front belonged to someone from another shore, a man he had once met in a harbor cafe years before. The letter was not urgent in its tone. It was an invitation to a conversation in a port city he knew well, about routes and a partnership opportunity that promised scale but required discretion. It spoke of markets beyond the city that could be more efficient if coordinated at a higher level. Rosario read the letter twice, then folded it and set it on the table. He felt a familiar ache, a tension between the draw of distance and the pull of home. The sea cued memories that smelled of salt and ledgers and long nights. It cued possibilities that might ease the neighborhood's precarious margins. At the same time, he knew that any larger partnership would demand trade-offs. He had learned that distance changes urgency, and now he had to decide whether to let distance carry more of his promise outward or to keep tending the margin at home. He did not answer immediately. He walked to the seawall in the dusk, the same place where so many of his small decisions had begun. The boat lights winked and became dots, and the ledger in his head clicked through names and obligations. In the end, he put the letter back in the envelope, wrote a short note asking for time to think, and tucked it into his pocket. Tomorrow he would show the apprentices the letter and ask their counsel. He believed in shared decisions now, in distributed stewardship. If he was to step outward, it would not be alone. He had built the habit of asking who pays, who recovers, and who holds the bridge when storms come. He would ask those questions again. For now, the harbor kept its small glare, and the neighborhood's mornings spun on, tested but standing. The story continued, as it must, with more small reckonings ahead. Rosario did not decide quickly. Decisions that mattered rarely announced themselves with thunder. They arrived like tides, quietly remapping the sand beneath your feet until you noticed the shoreline had moved. He slept on the letter and woke to a morning that felt ordinary only because the world had taught him to make ordinary mornings possible. He made coffee, folded the paperbacks he kept by the stove, and walked to the shop where Lucia already had the ledgers open and Marco was arguing gently with a delivery man about the best time to take a particular route. He set the envelope on the counter and let the room breathe around it. "An old contact," he said, without drama. "An offer of scale in a port city I know well." Lucia didn't look up immediately. She was tracing a set of debits. Marco glanced over and then smiled in that small, private way that meant he'd been given a puzzle he liked. "Sounds tempting," he said, "but scale means someone else writes the rules." Rosario nodded. "That's why I didn't answer yesterday. It's not about the trip. It's about what the trip would ask of the neighborhood." He explained what was on the page, the promise, the discretion requested, the possibility of smoother sourcing for certain goods that often had to be bought at premium when supplies wavered. He explained the risks in the terms he had long practiced, who paid when plans failed, who recovered, and how fast the neighborhood could get help if something broke. Lucia smiled wryly. She writes like an investor, careful, polite, confident the math absolves the messy parts. They did not treat the invitation as a single-man adventure. The culture Rosario had been cultivating was now a muscle. Decisions belonged to the group, and the group argued in marginalia and small meetings until a clear shape emerged. He called a meeting for that evening at the community room, and people came. Drivers, shopkeepers, a city aide who liked to read policy as if it were a map, and the developer from the logistics hub who had a knack for saying modern in a way that made others imagine new lights on old streets. Rosario started the meeting by reading the letter aloud. He did not dramatize it. The words were simply useful information. Then he asked the question he had been turning over all morning. If we go, who covers what when things go wrong on the other shore? The question pushed back against the romance of expansion and insisted on the arithmetic of consequence. A driver named Pietro, who had worked mornings for 20 years, spoke up. If you go, make sure you don't leave us with claims and no one to answer them, he said. If a truck breaks in a place we can't send help to, we're the ones who sleep in the cold because we stayed to make it right. A baker added, quietly, and promise me that any contracts signed abroad don't let them cancel local agreements at a week's notice. Their voices were practical and immediate. The developer, who had once bristled at the escrow clauses, surprised everyone by offering a compromise. If you take the trip, he said, let it be a delegation, not just you. Take people who can sign commitments back here, who can make sure that if the port idea goes forward, we have binding clauses that protect payroll and credit lines. It was an investor's concession dressed in the language of responsibility. Rosario liked the idea. Delegation was a way to extend distance without abandoning the people who lived at home. It allowed promises to be carried forward and honored because they were negotiated by a group that still answered to the neighborhood. He proposed a concrete plan. A small delegation, himself, Lucia, Marco, and a city aide, would visit the port city not merely to admire opportunities, but to draft a memorandum binding enough that the neighborhood could bring it to legal teams and insist on enforceable protections before any contracts moved funds or transferred obligations. They spent a week drafting the terms of the delegation, objectives, questions to ask, red lines they would not cross. Lucia wrote the checklists, what legal language must include, what escrow mechanisms would look like, how dispute resolution would happen across jurisdictions. Marco prepared a driver's manual of questions. What would happen to hours, how overtime was calculated, how a family's obligations would be respected when routes changed. Pietro rehearsed how to explain, plainly, why morning schedules mattered to a city official in another language. When they left, the neighborhood did not feel abandoned. They had built scaffolding, local protocols that delegated emergency authority to the Oversight Committee, and a promise that any major move required unanimous approval from a core council of elders. The delegation carried with them a small binder of guarantees, an outline of non-negotiables that included immediate payroll coverage for any displaced worker, a guaranteed hiring preference for local drivers for the first 18 months, and enforceable joint data governance over any shared platform. It was not sexy, but it was precise. The port city was familiar in many ways and foreign in others. Old docks smelled the same, the cadence of longshore talk cut similarly, men in raincoats kept their heads down against wind and bureaucracy. Rosario and the delegation met the contact at a cafe that leaned into the harbor. He was older than Rosario remembered, with lines around his eyes that looked like maps. He greeted them as if they had once shared bread. The first conversation unfolded more as reconnaissance than negotiation. They spoke of routes and timetables, of middlemen and bottlenecks, but always under an easy canopy of nostalgia. When they started to talk terms, the conversation shifted into careful navigation. The portman proposed a contract that offered reduced sourcing costs in exchange for a right of refusal on certain imports. He imagined a future where the neighborhood's shops received regular shipments at lower margins, freeing up capital for owners. Rosario listened and then methodically finished the sentence the man had left hanging. But, in exchange, you request operational levers to reassign routes when demand spikes, and you want the right to move certain processing to a central facility. The man nodded. That was the trade. Rosario then set out the delegation's black lines. No removal of local credit obligations, payroll guarantees, immediate escrow access, and legally binding hiring preferences. Negotiation became a test of tone as much as law. The portman appreciated Rosario's carefulness because it read as competence. He appreciated Lucia's clarity because it read as accountability. Marco's questions about driver rest and family obligations surprised some negotiators. They had not considered the human rhythm under the logistics talk. At moments, the conversation felt like a choreography. Legal clauses moved in, human terms moved around them, and the two spectrums forced the contract to take on an awkward but honest symmetry. A tricky point emerged over data governance. The port contact wanted a centralized data lake. Rosario insisted on joint ownership and local veto power over algorithmic changes that could affect routes. "Data is how you change the music," Rosario said, in a way that made the man's smile thin. "If you control the music, you control the dance. We want to make sure our dancers don't lose the rhythm that feeds them." The line drew a small laugh and a quiet assent. The delegations found common ground in language that neither dismissed technology nor surrendered people. The delegation spent a week shuttling between cafes, port offices, and small legal rooms. Contracts were drafted, red lines tested, compromises shaped into clauses with teeth. At night, they returned to a modest inn where they read each day's notes and translated them into the ledger Rosario kept in his head. Sometimes, deals shifted in the night as negotiators slept on the latest drafts. Sometimes Rosario woke with a line of law turning in his head and rewrote a clause before breakfast. The work was detailed and dull in the way that matters. Precise definitions, concrete timelines, payment schedules tied to verifiable outcomes. At the end of the visit, they had a document that would not make headlines, but would test the neighborhood's earnest attempt to scale responsibly. The memorandum committed the port operators to a phased supply arrangement, binding escrow provisions, and a joint governance board with equal representation. It included a clause that allowed the neighborhood to pause the rollout if displacement exceeded a set threshold, triggering immediate escrow payments and mandatory retraining budgets. That pause clause was perhaps the smallest thing with the most moral leverage. It gave real power to stop harm before it grew. When the delegation returned home, the neighborhood gathered in the same small meeting room where they had sent them. They read the memorandum aloud, line by line. There was skepticism. Legalese can be seductive in how it promises things that only lawyers can enforce. But there was also a cautious thrill, the possibility that scale could arrive without erasing morning routines. Pietro clasped his hands and said, "If this holds, our kids might get more steady work without losing the morning that lets them go to school." Lucia smiled in relief. Marco was already drafting operational plans for integrating a phased route. There were celebrations that were modest, a shared meal, a few toasts with cheap wine, and hands that touched shoulders in gratitude. Rosario felt the same steady satisfaction he had felt in other small fixes, but also the low hum of responsibility. The memorandum would need lawyers, clauses would be tested in courts and boardrooms, funds would be audited. The neighborhood had bought itself time and a framework, not a guarantee. As the light turned to evening and the group dispersed into their separate lives, Rosario slipped to the seawall alone. The port city's proposal had not been an easy path to take. It had been a test of whether distance could carry promises without dissolving them. He watched the surface of the water until the last light winked away. He had chosen delegation over departure, a ledger over a headline. It felt right in the marrow of things. When he walked back through the streets, past the shuttered shop fronts and the small gardens where neighbors left jars of tomatoes, he felt the ledger in his head like a map. Tomorrow there would be lawyers. There would be small meetings about who signed what. There would be more negotiations as the memorandum turned into contracts. He understood that the work was not finished. It never was. But for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of distance not as danger, but as potential, a way to carry promises farther without leaving the people at home behind. He folded his hands and breathed, tasting the salt on the air. The sea had given him lessons again, about distance, about timing, about how a promise travels. He walked home to sleep with the binder at his side, and the thought that perhaps the neighborhood had learned to trade not only in goods, but in careful reciprocity. The next chapter, he knew, would ask them to test whether the written guarantees could stand up to the practical storms of business. For now, the harbor held its small lights, and Rosario Gambino had placed another plank across the gap, cautious and exact, ready for the next tide. They brought the memorandum home like a fragile thing that needed a little light and a steady hand. In the days following the delegation's return, the neighborhood's small rooms filled with other kinds of people. Lawyers with neat pens, accountants who liked margins, a city official who loved protocols, and less formally, a baker who brought trays of warm pastries to meetings, and a driver who never seemed to stop asking practical questions until someone gave him a usable answer. The work moved from conversation into the slower, more patient labor of translation, turning good intentions into clauses and promises into schedules that could be read by a judge, a banker, or a weary shopkeeper. Rosario spent long mornings with Lucia at his side. She could read a contract the way some people read books, seeing the small clauses that hide costs. They parsed each line, asking the same questions he had always carried. Who pays in week 3 if a route fails? Who covers the mechanic if a truck is stranded in another jurisdiction? How quickly can the escrow be accessed, and by whom? And what proof would be required beyond a phone call? Lucia insisted on clarity, where men liked vagueness. If you can't explain it to Pietro in plain words, she told a young lawyer, it won't hold when things go bad. The lawyer scribbled and revised. Marco walked routes with drivers and fed the team the practical language that would anchor the legalese. He would stand among men oiling chains and ask, what exactly would you need delivered to sleep tonight? The answers were small and specific. A guaranteed 48-hour payment if a run failed, a documented alternative route within 2 hours, a phone number that reached a human who could allocate a replacement driver. These were not heroic demands. They were the kind of measures that keep people from making desperate choices. Marco's notes translated into bullet points the lawyers could draft into enforceable timelines. The developer of the hub grew impatient. He wanted faster signatures and less fuss. Conversations with him became a lesson in political temperament. He spoke in the language of infrastructure and jobs, of modern facades that would signal renewal, and he often seemed baffled by the insistence on slow safeguards. Yet, when Lucia read a clause about an emergency payroll bridge and asked specifically where funds would come from, his expression changed. Concrete obligations require cash. Investors murmur differently when legal words press against real money. The developer, who wanted the project to be attractive to his financiers, found that he needed to present a plan where minority protections did not look like endless liabilities, but like risk mitigation that kept politics calm and customers steady. The neighborhood scheduled public sessions, small ones without microphones or staged applause, where the memorandum's intent was explained and questions welcomed. These sessions mattered more than press releases. They allowed drivers to ask about the way their family obligations would be respected, allowed small shop owners to ask exactly how pipeline delays would be compensated, and gave Rosario a measure of the pulse that no spreadsheet ever captured. People did not want slogans. They wanted a tight list of actions they could expect if things went sideways. They wanted to know that an unforeseen delay in Port X would not mean an unpaid week. Those sessions produced small amendments to the memorandum, and for Rosario, that was the point. Contracts that began in committees and were shaped by the people most affected would have more force when enforcement mattered. Their legal team insisted on precise triggers for escrow disbursements, documented missed payrolls, verified gaps in deliveries that directly caused shop closures or audit-confirmed displacement beyond specified percentages. The clauses were tight and purposely bureaucratic. That bureaucracy was a kind of armor. It prevented frivolous claims and kept the fund from being drained on the basis of rumor. But it also required a careful local office to gather evidence, to validate claims, and to ensure prompt payments when warranted. For that, Lucia and Marco built a small verification desk with a modest staff, people who knew the neighborhood, knew the players, and could move with the speed that protocols allowed. The desk would act like a human interpreter between the legal clauses and the messy reality outside. When the first drafts of these formal documents moved forward, an unexpected force emerged: pride. Not the vanity kind, but a community pride that had been dormant and now had something to protect. Shopkeepers who had once shrugged off formalities now came to meetings with notes. Drivers who had been skeptical now asked to be part of the oversight roster. They wanted to be the ones who confirmed a claim when it was made. That willingness to invest time and governance surprised Rosario in the most welcome way. Oversight becomes meaningful when it is co-owned. A fund admin appointed by faceless parties lacks legitimacy. The neighborhood's participation in vetting claims meant the escrow would be harder to abuse and easier to defend. Of course, not everyone agreed. A few younger operators grumbled about the time spent in meetings they could not bill for. An investor, hearing of the neighborhood's insistence on local veto power over certain algorithmic changes, fretted about the risk of slowing innovation. He sent a note, polite and earnest, about pilot efficiency and the tyranny of process. The note made its way to Rosario's desk, and he set it down with care. He wrote back, not to scold, but to explain the arithmetic of dignity. Short-term speed without repair is a fragile fortune that dissolves when it rains. The investor eventually replied with a question mark and a risk-adjusted timetable that included stronger oversight. It was the kind of compromise that allowed business to go forward while acknowledging that data points have people behind them. Contracts were signed in the end with a certain calm that matched the neighborhood's temperament. No trumpets, no grand public unveiling. The hub's memorandum turned into a set of enforceable agreements that included phased implementation, escrow funding, payroll guarantees, hiring preferences, and joint governance boards. The platform agreed to a human override mechanism embedded in its code and to joint data governance protocols that required consent from the neighborhood's representatives before broad algorithmic changes were deployed. The money for an initial escrow was wired and matched in part by the developers as a show of good faith. It was not enough to make every skeptic comfortable, but it was a start. And for Rosario, the start was often the hard part. Implementation rolled out slowly and in deliberate stages. The first phase involved easier transfers, non-perishable goods, and a handful of scheduled runs that could be monitored without the immediate risk of collapse. Engineers from the platform worked alongside drivers in early morning hours, adjusting parameters and learning which human constraints the algorithm had missed. Marco sat with them, explaining why a driver's morning route often needed the same 2 side streets because of school schedules, or why certain shops could not accept afternoon deliveries because of their staff patterns. The adjustments were small, but meaningful. A route pause feature that respected a driver's strict overnight hours, a notification flag that prevented the algorithm from rerouting someone who had declared a childcare constraint. These were the kinds of tweaks that turned a sterile system into one that fit human life. Yet, the fox of temptation is always clever. A larger investment group appeared with a more attractive capital offer, promising to buy a larger stake if the neighborhood would agree to ramp faster. The offer came with beautiful projections and a glossy deck. It was the sort of thing that makes men with spreadsheets anxious for the future. Quick gains, improved margins, and market expansion. Some neighbors were tempted. At the cafe over cups of strong coffee, discussions grew heated. A couple of small owners argued that faster capital could help them modernize their shops and give their children more options. Others, remembering months of work to create safeguards, feared losing the hard-won protections. Rosario did not disdain the offer. He respected capital and recognized that sometimes faster money is useful when it does not chew through the social fabric. He asked the investors a simple question they had not expected. If we accept your terms, will you accept the escrow's enforcement mechanics as a covenant, not a suggestion? Will you be legally bound to the payroll bridge even if it reduces near-term returns? The investor's smile dimmed, and he asked for time. Money moves faster than trust, and trust moves in its own time. In the end, the neighborhood chose patience. They had chosen a different kind of growth, the kind that required a bit more negotiation and a bit less haste. The implementation's early months tested the new architecture. The first true trial came in a way that everyone had rehearsed for, but still felt different when it arrived. A sudden strike at one of the regional ports that disrupted a key supply chain. Crates that had been promised were delayed.
The platform's matching engine tried to reassign loads into tighter schedules, which risked overworking drivers and breaking the carefully negotiated constraints. The escrow's triggers activated when verified delays caused critical shops to miss payroll. The neighborhood's verification desk moved promptly, and Lucia, who slept badly that week, approved the first emergency payments. Drivers and shopkeepers received bridging funds that covered their essentials while alternative routes were arranged. It was not a perfect fix. There were small resentments and haggard nights, but the bridges held. The strike also revealed the human diplomacy sewn into the network. A broker from a far shore, someone Rosario had known in the earlier years, called in a favor and arranged for a patch shipment via an unconventional route that cost more but arrived in time for weekend demand. The cost came from the escrow, and the ledger balanced. Repayment terms were negotiated with suppliers, small contingencies were recorded, and the neighborhood arranged for some small remuneration for the broker's time. When the crates finally arrived, bakers baked and shopkeepers breathed again. It was a reminder that networks sometimes require favors that are not in any contract, but happen because people keep their part of the ledger. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood's cautious system began to show a pattern. When things worked, they worked in a way that built confidence. When things failed, the failure did not always become a catastrophe because the scaffolding caught it early. That pattern attracted a new class of sympathizers: city officials who liked calm neighborhoods, community activists who wanted durable jobs, and a few pragmatic investors who appreciated the reduced political risk of an enforceable safety net. The platform's engineers published a case study about hybrid human algorithm governance. It read like a balance sheet of humility. The best code is code that listens to people. For Rosario, the work never lost its small, intimate dimension. He still walked routes occasionally, hands in his pockets, listening for the subtle shifts. He showed Marco how to negotiate with municipal clerks in a way that clarified not just what they wanted, but why it mattered. He taught Lucia how to keep ledgers that told stories, not only numbers. He taught them that the moral force of policy lies less in its wording than in the practice of enforcing it when someone's rent is due. On a crisp evening, months after the memorandum had been inked, the developer's hub opened its first modern dock. There was a modest ribbon cutting. The mayor attended and made a short speech about responsible growth. The hub gleamed in the low light: cranes, well-marked bays, and a clean office. Some people cheered because the hub meant cleaner streets. Some watched skeptically because it meant the neighborhood's old rhythms were changing. The key, Rosario thought as he watched the lights and returned to the small shops, was the hub's surface gloss, but the existence of visible, operational safeguards that transferred authority and money in legally enforceable ways when needed. That night, he walked to the seawall and sat with the same quiet he had visited so many times. He watched the new dock lights reflected in the water and thought about how promises travel. The portman's letter had been a test of distance. Could the neighborhood send a delegation and return with a bargain that did not erode morning routines? The answer, tentatively and imperfectly, was yes. The contracts had teeth, the escrow had been used, and the procedures for oversight worked when stress arrived. It was not a story of triumph. It was the kind of incremental progress that buys space for ordinary lives to continue. He did not tell himself the work was done. He knew the human appetite for speed would return in new forms: software updates that pushed the algorithm to be more aggressive, investors who forgot how to count human hours as real costs, and politicians who liked headlines more than the slow arcs of accountability. But he also knew they had built a muscle: shared oversight, enforceable escrow, joint governance that made it harder for harmful haste to triumph without consequence. As the harbor darkened and the small lights winked across the water, Rosario felt, with a quiet steadiness, the small satisfaction of a man who had kept a promise and taught others to keep it too. The story continued, as these stories do, not in climactic moments, but in the steady accumulation of mornings that opened without fear. He rose when the tide whispered and walked back toward the neighborhood, ready for the next small problem the city would hand him.
The winter that followed was quieter than anyone expected, and that quiet was its own proof. The hub ran, the platform matched, the escrow sat where it was meant to sit, used, replenished, audited, respected. There were no miracles, no sweeping headlines, no single moment people would later point to and say, that was it. Instead, there were mornings that opened on time. Deliveries arrived within windows that made sense. Drivers slept. Shopkeepers planned. The city noticed not because something dazzled, but because nothing broke loudly. Rosario felt that kind of success most strongly in what didn't reach him anymore. The frantic calls at dawn thinned. The angry late-night knocks stopped. When problems did come, and they always do, they arrived early enough to be solved without tearing through families. That was the system working as it should, absorbing shock, distributing weight, preventing collapse. He began stepping back in ways so subtle that only Lucia noticed at first. He let Marco chair more meetings. He let Rosa, who had grown from careful apprentice into steady leader, sign off on escalation protocols without waiting for his nod. He attended oversight sessions not as a judge, but as a witness, speaking only when a question turned ethical rather than procedural. The community had learned the habit of repair. It no longer required his constant hand to practice it. One evening, a young driver approached him outside the cafe. The man was new to the neighborhood, still learning the rhythms. He thanked Rosario awkwardly, explaining that during a winter delay, his pay had come through without him needing to beg or explain. "I didn't panic," the driver said, surprised at his own words. "I just waited, and it worked." Rosario nodded, feeling something loosen in his chest. Panic is expensive. Systems that remove panic save more than money. The sea called to him less often now, not because it had lost its lessons, but because he had finally placed those lessons where they belonged, in people, in contracts, in habits that didn't require solitude to remember. When he did walk the seawall, he no longer felt the old tension between distance and responsibility. Distance had become a tool the community could use without losing itself. The letter from the port city remained folded in a drawer. There were no more invitations like it. Word had traveled, not that Rosario Gambino was powerful, but that he was precise, and that working with his neighborhood meant agreeing to carry the human cost of decisions openly. That reputation filtered offers before they reached his door. He preferred it that way. In spring, the city published a modest report praising measured growth with community safeguards. It was the kind of document few people read and many benefited from. Rosario skimmed it once, then passed it to Lucia, who marked passages for the team. The work had never been about recognition, it had been about continuity. On a warm afternoon, the community gathered without agenda. Someone grilled food. Children ran between tables. Drivers argued about routes they no longer dreaded. Bakers talked about expanding hours because supply felt reliable again. Rosario sat among them, not at the center, listening as he always had. When someone asked him what came next, he answered honestly. "Maintenance," he said. "Attention. Remembering why we built this the way we did." That night, he went home early. He placed his old ledger, the one with names and favors and quiet debts, on a shelf beside newer binders filled with policies and procedures. The ledger had taught him how trust worked. The binders ensured trust didn't depend on one man forever. Before sleeping, he thought of the harbor from his childhood, the way boats became small lights and then disappeared without vanishing. He understood now what that boy on the seawall could not. Things endure not because they stay close, but because someone builds a way for them to return intact. The neighborhood slept. Morning came. Doors opened. Life moved. And that, in the end, was the story.